My name is Brian O'Connell. I'm a reporter on Today with Claire Byrne, which is on RT Radio 1. I've been a journalist for about 20 years. And before that, I was a spectacular failure as an actor.
Well, I'm going to really focus on that spectacular.
Why not? Let's pry it open.
But before all that, let's like you looking back on yourself now as a young lad, was there kind of that performative element, or what, like was kind of the arts around you from a young age? Would you kind of look back and kind of go, God, that was destined for me to be a journalist or to be a media head or to be.
Um, Funny enough, I grew up in Ennis, and we were surrounded by traditional music, so the arts were present without us really labeling it the arts, if you know what I mean. But I didn't. There was no real youth drama. Glore hadn't been established at that stage. There was no panto, for example. I didn't see a panto till I came to Cork in university, and the first play I probably saw was a version of Othello, which we were studying for Leaving Cert. I had a fantastic English teacher called Manning Sperry, who I'm still in touch with. And he really opened my mind to English and the possibilities of drama and theatre, poetry and writing fiction. So he brought us to see Othello, and that really began, I suppose, a lifelong interest in theatre. I came to UCC. I was very fortunate in UCC to have a group of people in my class and my peers, like people like Tom Creed, Cillian Murphy was around, Des Bishop was around, you had lots of actors, writers, Thomas Conway. There was all these people in our year, so, and I did a lot of drama during my undergraduate, and probably thought at one point that I might try and become an actor. But I was always drawn to the arts. I was drawn to the performance side of it. But I just didn't have much of a chance to express it when I was younger. And then when I did express it, nobody was really interested.
A common tale.
Yeah.
Um, and then obviously, I'm kind of flipping way forward here. I'm kind of go back and kind of, have a look around the edges of that. But then, like, kind of journalism, like when you sort of go, okay, I like being an actor and I want to be an actor, but then I just say no. And like, was it a kind of clear decision, or kind of how was that?
No, journalism was a total accident. I did an undergraduate degree, English and history. I got a scholarship to do a master's in history. I was looking at Irish land history, of all things, in West Clare, 19th century land history. Halfway through that, I decided I'd become an actor for a year or two. That was a spectacular disaster. And then I ended up at a party a couple of years later, got talking to a guy. Turns out he was the editor of the Examiner. And he said, "Do you ever think of writing?" And literally that was my way in. And I started writing mainly the arts, broadened into features, moved from features into more kind of serious current affairs stuff, and then moved from print journalism into broadcast and RT maybe 9 or 10 years ago, and I've been there ever since. I suppose it is people's stories, isn't it? And there is a link there. When I was younger, I was always interested in stories. And I still have that interest, and it's being curious, and it's kind of knocking on the door and lifting the lid and looking at what's behind something. And I am a real people person. I love hearing from people. I love people telling me things, sharing things. So that in a way has sustained it. And I suppose being on radio, there is an element of performance there. So it probably scratches that itch that I might have had a few years ago.
Yeah. And come here, then, kind of, as you say, that's that kind of same drive, or the creative drive, or the kind of inquisitive drive is there. And also, you've obviously written, a couple of books, and we can come back to that in a minute. But were you writing kind of from as a very young kid? I mean, was writing, that's something you did?
I can remember having a little book on the go myself when I was maybe 8, 9, 10 years of age. So I was always writing. And then any essay I would have done in secondary school, I would have wrote fiction, first. So yeah, I was always interested in writing. I was really into the likes of Hopkins, suppose, obviously Emily Dickinson. I was really into Thomas Kinsella, loved Shakespeare. I got really into Sean O'Casey. So it was there. There was no history of it in my family particularly. My dad was an electrician. My mom was a nurse. their generation before them were all farmers from West Clare. So I was the first, I think, in the family to go to university. So it wasn't that great of a tradition around me, but there was a small group of us around Ennis, and they were of a similar mindset. And then obviously when I came to university, I just was amazed that someone hands you Socrates, or someone hands you, and this is what you're doing every day, and it just blew my mind when I was in college, and that was the start of it, really. But journalism, funny enough, I found an old career guidance note from a career guidance teacher when I was about 16 or 17. He had wrote journalism down. Now, I wouldn't have been able to express that I wanted to be a journalist then, but he had sort of pieced it together a little bit. I only found it a couple of years ago, and I thought, oh, that's really interesting. That was maybe 6 or 7 years before I kind of fell into the career in media.
And when you, but was it kind of when at that party when you kind of got offered, to come in and do a bit of writing, but was it? It wasn't a kind of an alien thing to you, though. It wasn't something. Go, Jesus, that would never. It was something that you kind of felt you could give a hand to.
Yeah, it made sense in a way, and I thought, yeah, I probably could do that. And I think I went in and I interviewed a band, or I can't remember what the first piece I did was, and you see your name in the paper, and you think, well, that's kind of nice. And it just snowballed from there. It built and built and built. And I had been doing a bit of teaching as well. It was either going to be teach or media. There was this sort of yin and yang for a year or two. I'd applied for the dip, much to my mum's insistence. And just at the final moment, I thought, well, I'll give the writing, I'll give newspapers 1 more year, 2 more years, and sure, if it doesn't work out, I would have been delighted to be a teacher. There's teachers in the family. I think it was a fantastic profession, but I just thought I'd give it a year or two. And, there were various bumps along the road, but obviously, thankfully, on some level, it has worked.
Yeah. So go back to the disastrous career as an actor for a second, because I'm not going to let you away with that lightly. Like, as any young person who has that kind of grow in them, or has that piece in them to kind of settle. I mean, Cork is a beautiful city, but it's a hotbed of artistic talent. And that generation that you came out of college with, there was a lot going on there.
Yeah, and Kirkadurka were at their height. I mean, I think I auditioned for the second run of Disco Pigs, which Orla Fitzgerald was cast in, and Kevin O'Leary. That was the second version of it. Killian and Eileen had done the first version. Started in a little box in the Triskel and went global. So there was all of that happening in Cork. There was a brilliant dance scene with Sir Henry's nightclub. There was just so much happening at that time, and you couldn't but end up in a play. Do you know what I mean? It was, if you were around those people, you were going to end up in something. Yeah. And I had done a couple of plays, like in The Everyman. I played young Charlie and Da, and I was in a play called Rashomon, which is directed by Jeff Gould, which was quite good. And what else was I in? I was in a version of an art Death of a Salesman. I was in that as well. American accent was pretty dodgy. So I was starting to build a little bit, but I think I probably needed to be in Dublin back then. I was getting the train up, auditioning for ads and auditioning for, I think I auditioned for a kids' TV series. And it was, it was slow. It was probably would have been a pretty okay amateur actor. I'm not sure I would have made it as a professional.
So, I mean, then, the dreams of, I mean, didn't you work in the bar for a while in the Everyman?
I did, yeah. I worked in the bar in the Everyman for about, it was definitely a couple of years when I was in university. That was super, because late night licenses weren't the thing then generally in bars. And then the Everyman, because it had a performer's license, could have a late bar. It was fantastic. Everybody was around. You had jazz every year. You got to see the best of musicians. And it was a time when theatre companies still toured. So Red Kettle would be in with Jim Nolan played The Salvage Shop, Neil Tobin cast in it. Druid were touring. There was Brown Penny. There were a lot of companies touring back then. And the bar manager, Sheila, ended up in a Brendan O'Carroll play. She was like, running the bar one day, and the next day she was touring for like 9 months with Brendan O'Carroll. It was mad. Like, you had all these opportunities. You'd end up on stage the odd time because somebody wouldn't be around. I remember Mick Lally being in doing a couple of plays. Brilliant, and obviously during that period, I was seeing theatre every night of the week. You know, Neil LaBouche had that Oscar winner was in during 2005. I can't remember his name. What play was he in? I'll think of it. So you had some incredible, you know, big productions in there as well. And yeah, so I was surrounded by it. And then you had the old amateur dramatics were still there, the kind of Cork actors. I remember a guy, Pat O'Driscoll, who directed me one or two plays, gave me the advice, sure, any fucker can play Hamlet. So you had all of this going on, you know. And I had a great time, fantastic time.
And come here, I mean, you've written about it obviously in your first book, and you know, but like for people that don't know, you was also a lot of turmoil kind of around your life at that time. So I mean, when did that start becoming an issue for you? You know,
I'd say it was sort of gradual from like my late teens, early 20s on, and then by the age of 12, it was clear that alcohol is having a big impact on my life. And perhaps, you know, it does go hand in hand with that lifestyle. If you're around the arts a lot, you're going to be out socializing, you're going to be out late at night. You don't have to be up at 9 o'clock on a Monday or Tuesday morning. Generally, you know, I know a lot of artists would, but you can work late or whatever. So it just became an established pattern where I was drinking a lot. And that in turn began to have a significant impact on my day-to-day life. So on getting a place to live, on contact with my family, on being able to maintain, I mean, I'd still been writing at the time for the Examiner, but I wasn't very reliable. So I'm being able to maintain an income and being able to hold down a job. And then at about the age of, so I'm 44 now, so it was about 27, my parents intervened eventually, and my family intervened and said, you know, you need to get help for this. It's having a huge impact. I didn't really have a place to live. I was sleeping on a friend's couch. I'd been evicted from a place previously. I owed quite a bit of money. I'd had a car repossessed. So, you know, so I had a whole lot of things. And when you look at the things to try and establish whether or not you have a drink problem, I was ticking all the boxes. So they intervened when I was about 27, and I went to rehab to a place called Tabor Lodge in West Cork. And 18 of us were in a rehab centre for 28 days. You had people who had All-Ireland medals. You had people who were breaking into houses. You had a whole cross-section of society, business executives and so on, and a range of addictions. So I was very lucky in that it gave me time and space for the first time in years up to that point to be able to sit back, kind of unpack my life, look at all the various times and things where things hadn't gone right, and look at where I was at and where I had anticipated I would be at, and see that alcohol was a huge factor in me not allowing myself to kind of fulfill potential or to have what I would have considered a normal life. And like, I struggled with some of the religious aspects of recovery in Ireland, especially AA. I would think is still quite religious. You know, the Our Father has said a lot of AA meetings, which I struggled with personally, but definitely rehab for me was hugely beneficial. And I came out of rehab, it was like 2 days before Christmas in 2005, I think. And that was it, you know, thankfully, touch wood, I haven't drank since. I wrote a piece a couple of years later for the Irish Times, really on what it's like to be sober in Ireland in your late 20s. And then from that, I wrote a book in 2009. So I was about 4 or 5 years sober. It was probably a bit soon in retrospect. I probably should have waited a few more years. But it just sort of came, you know, I wrote the piece in the Irish Times, book deal came through, and I wrote that. And then you become the kind of drink guy for a couple of years. So every time drink is being discussed, you get the call and you're discussing it. There's probably someone from the drinks industry, yada, yada. And it was a difficult road to navigate because, like, I have no issue with alcohol. I would still go to the pub. It wasn't that I had an issue with alcohol. I just began to look differently at our cultural association with alcohol and the accepted societal norms around alcohol, something I'd never really questioned. But obviously, when I went through that difficulty myself, I began to question it. And I began to look at how we engage with alcohol. And that's what I wrote about in the book. The book was called Wasted. It came out in 2009. The first couple of chapters, I'm probably too honest, talking about my own story. And then I talk about Ireland's relationship and why is it that we have such a functional relationship at that point.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting you say that because, you know, about your own experience. You know, it must have been very strange for you. I mean, beyond the personal kind of trauma of having to kind of go through and realize and, you know, recover, but also being that journalistic head to kind of go, oh, I want to examine this now. You know, to try
I
to
know.
do
I
separate.
know.
You
Yeah,
know,
it was like I remember in the book I spent 2 or 3 days with early morning drinkers because I was just really curious as to what, like, is it beneficial? Is it better that they would be in a pub early morning as opposed to at home drinking? So there was that journalistic edge to me where I was, and then at the same time it was free counselling for me because I was still figuring it out and I was still figuring out my own relationship with it, and I was still trying to figure out the culture I grew up in and what I had absorbed almost subconsciously
yeah,
and how that had impacted my drinking pattern later, and how I'd never questioned it, how I'd never questioned alcohol and sex, or how I'd never questioned, you know, so many things around your emotional vocabulary and alcohol and all that. So it was interesting on that level for me. It was interesting as a journalist, obviously, in terms of looking at society, but as an inner journey, it was very interesting too, to almost have that free counseling. And then there was another reason as well, like the book is on the shelf there and it's sort of like, it sort of keeps me off drink. Do you know what I mean? Because I'd be the biggest hypocrite in Ireland if I went back drinking, having written this book and being the guy. And I remember I went on the Late Late to talk about it. You know, you do all these things. So it kind of kept me off the drink for years. Now I cannot remember the last time I thought about alcohol
yeah,
or I thought about drinking, which I'm lucky. And like I think Ireland is a much easier country to be sober in now than it was when I was 15 or 16 years ago. Like it was quite difficult to be sober and to socialize then.
yeah.
The cafe culture hadn't been established. You didn't have the range of non-alcoholic beers. People weren't into fitness and all of that kind of stuff as much as they are now. So going out now and not drinking, I don't think is as big a deal.
Yeah, I mean it's interesting, you know, and you know, you write about it, is you, as you say, totally honestly warts and all in your book. And the one piece I'm fascinated with though is the slide kind of into it when something becomes a problem, because an awful lot of your experiences would match mine as a young lad around the same era, kind of, you know, growing up, where drinking drugs and, you know, light drugs, whatever, were the thing, particularly around not so much the arts, not blaming the arts, but around that kind of, you know, culture of solving the world when one goes out for a pint, you know. It's kind of and I just think, like, what was there moments for you that you realized that, okay, there's a problem here, or just kind of, you know, that it's
Um, yeah, I mean, there were a few experiences. I didn't have as much contact with my son as I should have had because I couldn't take him overnight, really. So I'd lost a number of roles and jobs and income streams. So that's obviously a major warning sign. Like I said, I'd been evicted from one house and I was pretty much just sleeping on a friend's couch or in a spare room, and I couldn't hang on to a place myself. So there are big life things that I wasn't able to do. And yeah, there was a couple of moments. I was at a party where someone died, and that had a profound effect on me. And there were a couple of things, all right, that happened where I thought, uh, I'm sort of moving into a darker phase here when I look at myself in the mirror. And I suppose my parents might have recognized that, but when they rang and said, look, we want to meet you at this counseling session, and I was ready for it then. I was like, well, I sort of want this too. Um, and it's a funny one because you really, when you're in the middle of it, don't quite see it. Like I can see my life now and see what I have and what I've built up and my career and my family and the small kids and the house and all of this, and think, yeah, sure, like that's it. When you don't drink, you get all that. But when you're in the middle of it, it's so hard to see it. And that's why I think for people I would have known over the years who would have gone to rehab and relapse, the difficulty was when their life didn't change hugely. And so that distinction between life with alcohol and life without alcohol wasn't hugely different. So hard to stay sober then,
yeah,
because you might, you know. So I was just really, really lucky that I'd say within a couple of months of coming out of rehab, I was writing for the Irish Times, for example. I was really into work. Like I became obsessed by work for a couple of years. And that probably became my addiction for a while. So now, of course, it's the middle-aged thing of running, isn't it, or whatever. Sad. When I'm at races now, funny enough, when I'm at the start line, I look around. It's like the back bar of Sir Henry's nightclub 20 years ago. We're all getting our legal highs.
Come here. Like, that's so apt actually. So I'm just thinking of my own life and kind of people that I meet out for walks and kind of
Yeah.
Um, in relation to like obviously this is a special access chat that we could ask to do as part of Recovery Month. But like, and what's that word say mean before we go on to talk about the kind of journalism? Like, what's that word mean to you? Like, what does that whole
Recovery.
yeah?
No, I'll be honest with you. I struggle with a lot of the terminology around alcoholism and addiction in Ireland. And I struggled with the term alcoholic for a start. And I felt when I identified as somebody having a problem with alcohol, and I did use the term alcoholic, but it was so taken out of context in an Irish setting that it was really difficult to own that term back when I was 16 or 26 or 27 and talking about it, because there was such an extreme definition attached to it. And like the same way with the word recovery, um, I I kind of struggle with that as well, to be honest. And I'm not sure why. Maybe I need to kind of get over it. But I don't like being defined. I don't like the idea of recovery, meaning that I'm always sort of in the throes of this thing is something I don't like. I don't like being defined by it. And I was determined. I know this is totally ironically because I wrote a book about it, became very public, but I didn't want to be defined purely by virtue of the fact that I wasn't drinking alcohol anymore. And the same way I did a campaign with Trinity a while ago where they used photographs of people who were in recovery. So I did identify with that. But like, I suppose because I'm lucky in that I don't have to work too hard at it. Like, I don't think about alcohol every day. I don't feel the urge. I do drink non-alcoholic beers the odd time. I might have one a month or two a month. So the idea of always being in recovery or being in remission, I'm not sure. Yeah, I sort of still, you can hear I'm struggling with it. I'm just not sure about those types of terms.
Yeah, because it's an interesting one because I think it's like I think it can be a great help to people who are kind of that like phraseology to people who are kind of starting a journey or going on a journey and looking at kind of journeys
Totally.
that are possible. But also, it's kind of I would view it in the same way as phrases like even phrases like naming different places and then you have associations with that. So you're kind of someone from Ballymun or someone from Blackrock or someone from Cork. It's kind of like we're very easy in Ireland to kind of pigeonhole people into boxes, rather than looking at. So I understand where you're kind of coming from.
Yeah, totally. Like people who would be in recovery or who would be, say, therapists or counselors would say that because I drink non-alcoholic beers that I have essentially relapsed.
Yeah.
And that would be this one kind of black and white view on me, because I went into pubs and drank coffee or had a whatever ballygown, I relapsed. So look, I think the one thing I've learned about addiction over the years, and the one thing I've learned about rehab in Ireland and about how we treat addicts is that I think it's a bit rigid sometimes. And I've noticed that, say, obviously over the years, families would have called me where they've had, issues, and I would talk to people, and it isn't one size fits all. And I think that sometimes our model of therapy and counseling and rehab is a little bit rigid, and I think it needs to just widen. Now, I can understand why it's rigid, and there are tried and tested techniques and so on, but just think it needs to be a little bit more holistic and realistic sometimes.
Yeah, but I think as well the wider conversation, less about recovery, but more about the role of certain substances in Irish culture, and that I think that's a broader and in some ways as interesting conversation for those that maybe don't that have problems but don't identify or aren't within certain.
Yeah, well, I mean, I obviously grew up with the romanticization of people like Brendan Behan and Shane McGowan, and it wasn't until I met Conor McPherson and we talked about alcohol, and I started, seeing McPherson's work. And I remember he telling me that Ireland was the only country in the world where when you walk into a bar, the guy standing at the bar drinking a ballygown, that's the alcoholic. And so when I started seeing McPherson's work and a few other people, Christy Moore has been very good over the years, that then I began to challenge those artistic and cultural associations we have and the romanticization of alcohol we have in Ireland. which like I think Arthur's Day, I don't know if you remember that event, they were trying to have this sort of national day of celebration, and there was a real pushback from the artistic community and from lots of other people against that, and it didn't go ahead. I think it went ahead 1 year or 2 years, but it didn't. But at one point people drew the line. Christie was very strong on it. That for me was a real moment. It was a moment where we were asserting ourselves and say, well, hang on a second, like we get annoyed in Ireland when we're stereotyped on EastEnders or on The Simpsons as these punch-drunk paddies. But sure, we were the biggest peddlers of that stereotype for decades ourselves. We sent it out there every Paddy's Day, and then we had this Artist Day where you're celebrating, you know, the Guinness. And the Guinness family were amazing and as philanthropists at certain periods. But I mean, it was just marketing, you know. So I thought that was a real moment of maturity for Ireland, where we started to say, well, hang on a second, we're going to start controlling this narrative ourselves a little bit here. And I don't think anyone could say today that, like, of course, Irish people like to drink, but I think Irish society is so profoundly different now than what it was. And I think the actors and artists and writers I meet, it's their career now, and you know, they're like, I'm meeting a good friend of mine, Ray Scanlon, for lunch today, and Ray's got 3 or 4 things on the go. He works and works and works and works. He's fit, he's into yoga, you know what I mean? Yeah. So it's like, it's a different type of person to survive in this world, I think.
And then over the last, you know, number of years, you mentioned the Irish society changing, and you know, because it has done, but also, I mean, you've been right in the midst of that through your role, you know, within, say, you know, today, particularly on RTE, and, you know, and obviously you've like, done lots more, but just like focusing on that particularly over the last, you know, many years. And like, you know, and then obviously your novel, your book, sorry, the personal, you know, columns. And I'm just fascinated in that kind of the fact of you going out and meeting so many people, ranging from the sublime to the ridiculous to the very, very serious.
Yeah.
At moments, I mean, just, you know, are there moments when you kind of catch yourself, Brian, and kind of go, holy Jesus, this, I'm standing here and this is going on, and you know, or is, you know, are there moments that kind of you kind of have that, you know?
Yeah, well, I like, you know, I've always been curious, and I'm really interested in people, and I did a report about 3 years ago where I got into the Central Mental Health Hospital in Dublin, which was in Dundrum. And it's where, obviously, if people are found not guilty by reason of insanity, is it guilty by reason of insanity or not guilty? You need to check. Anyway, so it's obviously in there you would have people who would have committed some pretty horrendous crime. Obviously, they have been found to have been insane at the time, so they're receiving treatment. So I was there to chat to a few people, and I walked into a room. I sat on a guy's bed, and he had a guitar. He'd been there quite a while, and we were chatting, and I said, I didn't ask the question, but I kind of let him build up and build up and build up. And then he eventually had to address it. And he said, you probably want to know why I'm here. And I said, well, why are you here? And he said, well, I killed my father. And it was the first time he'd publicly said it. And it was an extraordinary conversation that we had, and we broadcasted on Radio 1. He'd had the support of his family. His mom still visited him. We had checked permission with her that it was okay to broadcast. So, you know, there's very little prepares you for a conversation like that. And you're sitting on someone's bed and you're trying to work that out. And he brought me back to the scene, and we walked through it and we talked about it. And it was moments like that. I mean, I remember walking out of there later that day and feeling that was an incredible experience. And it was incredible to share somebody for the first time talk like that 20 or 30 years earlier. Yeah. And, you know, a huge privilege. So, and then with the personals, with the book I did, it was really simple. It's just pure curiosity. I used to do reports a couple of times a year on the small ads in newspapers. Wedding dress for sale, never worn. And I'd always think, wonder why it wasn't worn. And I'd ring them up. And I'd say, would you tell me that story? What happened? Narrow escape, or what was the story? So I went from that to the wedding rings, and then you'd see World War II memorabilia, and then you'd see all sorts of, it was a doorway into people's lives, really simple. And then the book came out of that, and it did really well last year. So yeah, I kind of like that, because that was something that I have just been sort of obsessed about myself. and to see it as a book, like, it's kind of amazing, isn't it?
Well,
But
also,
that's just,
there's kind of two different, I'd say, as well, and I think you've kind of written about yourself, the fact that like a lot of journalistic work within your normal world is either stories that have broken or breaking, and it's very, it's narrative driven. But those stories, you don't know what the hell you're going to find behind them. It's not. There's no end point to
but
it.
yeah, but that's the beauty, because a lot of journalism today is news led, and there's breaking news cycle, and whereas there are lots of communications personnel, PR companies, and so on. So for me to get to stories like I did in the book, and it was just following your nose. It was just ringing people up when you'd see ad on Dundee that looked kind of quirky or interesting, or I got the Evening Echo every week for about 2 years, and I would just follow and they had a free ad set supplement every Tuesday, and I would just ring up as many as I could if I saw something a little bit unusual or quirky, or I thought there might be something in that. And that was it. It just ends up in a book on a shelf. Then it's amazing, isn't it? Like that you go from that, and it like going through rehab. I suppose, okay, being in recovery, to use that phrase.
Yeah.
So what that has done, I think, has allowed me to be pretty emotionally present and open. So if I'm in an interview, like with the guy in the room who's telling me about killing his father, I'm in tears listening to him. And when I'm in those really difficult interviews that I would do, I am very emotionally present. And I think having taken alcohol out of my life, it allowed me to access bare emotions like that I wouldn't have been able to before, because you're masking it and you're kind of dulling it, I think. So I think that's how being in recovery has definitely helped my career and the kind of work I'm doing. And I'm obviously drawn to people on the fringes, and I'm drawn to people who are in addiction. Like, I've done lots of reports on addiction over the years, so I'm drawn to that. I'm drawn to prisons. I'm drawn to people who are going through a difficulty, because oftentimes I would chat to people, especially if I'm doing something on people, say rough sleepers, or if I'm doing something on addicts, and I would say to them, I'm 15 years sober myself. Like, I have a huge affinity with people like that, because I suppose on one level, without trying to like on one level, I think that was so easily could have been me. Like, it was just pure luck that it wasn't.
I mean, you mentioned there again. You kind of an award-winning journalist. You've won awards like in the arena of like Justice, PPI awards. I mean, when like the arena of I'm fascinated by journalists, and I'm fascinated by that kind of that empathetic space, but also that kind of cold eye space where you have to be the neutral observer in interviews, which you might have very different views or very similar views to the person that you're interviewing, but can't. Is that hard?
Yeah, well, obviously working for RTE, there are certain guidelines that we sign up to in terms of expressing or not expressing opinions online that might in any way impinge on the impartiality of ourselves or of the broadcaster's take on particular news events. So I actually find that quite liberating in a way, because I am not too into... I don't think you should be able to tell my personal opinions from my work, to be honest. Okay, you might be able to tell, hopefully, that I have some degree of empathy,
Yeah.
but I don't think you should be able to. I don't think you should have much of an idea how I might vote or what I might think about kind of geopolitical um, events and so on. So it's like anything. You have to park all that. You have to go and do your job. You have to try and be impartial and balanced. And obviously, we're governed by the BAI, and we're governed by all sorts of guidelines, so that you have to give both sides, and that's right and fair. But take COVID over the last 6 months. It is a huge privilege to have this ringside seat, and to be able to report on something like that over 6 months, from the very beginnings to meeting funeral directors, I went into an order of enclosed nuns, I remember, after 3 weeks, to say, well, how do you self-isolate? You've been doing it for so long, tell us how we do it. And to telling the really harrowing accounts of meat factory workers inside meat factories, whistleblowers over the last couple of months. I've been getting their accounts and trying to get their trust to talk to you, because they're a terrified, vulnerable community. And it's reports like that where you feel, okay, will have some impact,
Yeah.
and you really get a lot back from that.
Yeah. And the sense as well of responsibility is one thing, but kind of that feeling of, you know, when you follow your nose to an interview and then suddenly something breaks in front of you, there must be a moment of kind of going, oh Jesus, I'm the only one that knows this, or you know, and that kind of doubling of kind of excitement from a journalistic point of view of breaking something, but also from a personal responsibility point of holding that.
Yeah, but I suppose, you know, I've been on this show that I'm on. I worked on it when Pat Kenny was presenting, then Sean O'Rourke. Sarah McInerney was there for the summer, and now we've Claire Byrne, who I worked with years ago on Afternoon TV, and who's super. So I've an amazing team of producers. I don't, even though I'm out there on my own, I never feel alone. We're on WhatsApp all the time. So if something breaks, you've got this wealth of experience there in the office, this production team that I'm constantly in touch with. To as a team, you know, obviously something like whistleblowers inside meat factories. That's, I mean, it's obviously I'm getting access to the people, but it's a whole team effort to get translators and actors to disguise their voices, to get it legal, to decide how are we going to put it on air, who are we going to get to react to it, how are we going to script it. So there's a lot involved. It's like a production. It's like actually like putting on a production. You really got to think, okay, how's the audience going to react? Do they need a little bit more? Should we put in some of the translated voice? So there's all of that, and I suppose that I'm not alone in that. You know, there is a responsibility. You do still get, I don't really get nervous anymore, but you would get that sense of, right, I'm in a heightened state here now where I really got to be on my game because this is just broke. And I have a huge responsibility. You might be on the first half hour of the show, you know, there's a big audience. It's adrenaline. You get a bit of a rush off it.
Yeah. Come here, I won't keep you much longer, but I'm just interested in, you mentioned yourself about the way Irish society has kind of changed radically over the last kind of 10, 15 years, you know, culturally, politically, whatever, you know. But I think, and also from a journalism point of view, from a media point of view, from a social media, you know, from that kind of, you know, news breaks everywhere. And it must be, I mean, there's two questions, I suppose. To be around that huge change must be very exciting, you know, to be at the coalface of it and to see it breaking, but also then to be around in an era when, like, there's no dearth of information, you know, online, and the particularly for somebody like yourself, the kind of the carving away at opinion versus fact must become even more difficult as we have gone into the social media age.
Yeah, and you know, there are quite a few journalists now who are activists and quite public as activists, and I don't know if that's a good or a bad thing. And maybe I was an activist for a couple of years. I mean, I was certainly strong on the alcohol issue for quite a few years, so maybe that was me, and maybe I've just have muted a lot of that in the last few years. Like, it's an incredible job. I'm very lucky to work for RTE. I'm very lucky to be able to pursue the kind of work that really interests me as well. But it's a really difficult career to get into now. And I wonder about all of the people coming out of journalism courses and where the opportunities are going to be for a job that will allow you to buy a home or to rent a nice house in a nice area or whatever, you know, just to have those basic aspects of human life, because the opportunities are becoming less and less. So you wonder about that. You know, for me, it was that real cliche thing of just being passionate about it, and the career sort of followed from the passion. I'd like to go back to theatre at some stage. I mean, in my head, I kind of have it in my head that I'd like to write a play at some point based on those changes I see in Irish society, because I don't really see that on the stage a whole lot. Ireland is, in 15, 17 years, is profoundly different country, profoundly different. And there are some good things with that, like the rise of a cafe culture, like the fact that some cultural associations are being challenged in a big way. And then there are some negatives, the sort of the ego, the obsession with physique and body and image and that kind of stuff, and the pressure, I think, that's on people, the pressure to be male, the pressure to be female in our society. You know, there are lots of things happening. So at some point, I have it in my head, I'd like to get back to that. I had an idea for a third book next year. I'm just seeing if anybody's interested. And it's me spending. Oh yeah, so we'll see where that goes. And it's a simple idea of me spending quite a lot of time with people who are dying, and really trying to learn about life from those who are dying. Now, it's a little bit of a hard sell because it sounds a bit morose, but I actually think it'll be quite uplifting. But anyway, if that doesn't work out, I kind of have it in my head. I'd love to re-engage with the arts. I'd love to.
Yeah. Well, look, I'll leave you on that. And it's funny, you're after triggering a phrase. One of my favorite bands at the moment are Lazarus Soul. They're a Dublin band. But Brian Brannigan, the singer, I believe, is one of our poets at the moment. But he has a phrase which just when we were talking about that book idea, and I'm probably going to mess up in the middle of it. But he goes, sometimes I worry about death, and then I remember before I was born, I didn't exist, and it wasn't so bad.
Brilliant.
You know, and I kind of go, that's a really interesting
Yeah.
kind of not joy in death, but that acceptance piece. So yeah, I
Yeah.
hope someone does pick up your book, Brian.
There you go.
Thanks.
Great to chat to you, Mark.
No worries, and good luck and all.
See you later, man. Appreciate it.